From religion to wrestling, gumbo to grits, politics to poetry, and all things Southern in between, this is Take on the South. Produced by the Institute for Southern Studies and hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, Take on the South examines the highs and lows of the American South, examines the truths and fictions of the country's most distinctive region, and picks the brains of some of its most accomplished students. To understand the South, you need to take it on, and that's what we'll be doing. Join us as we take on the South.
Welcome to Take on the South. I am Kent Germany, a professor of history here at the University of South Carolina. I am not Mark Smith, and if you are a fan of the podcast, you can tell that my voice is a little bit different than Professor Smith's. I am going to be guest hosting today, which I am referring to as guest smithing, and so any mistakes point to me and not to Professor Smith. I'm delighted to have in the studios of the Institute for Southern Studies Dr. Carolyn Grego, who is an environmentally minded historian of the South. She is an assistant professor of history at Queen's University in Charlotte, North Carolina. She holds a PhD in history from the University of Colorado. And as she will tell us, she is a historian of and from South Carolina. And I want to throw things over to her very quickly, but let me let you know who we're talking to here. She has a career as an assistant professor. She's published already in the Journal of American History. She has published an article in the American Historical Review. And we'll be talking today about her award-winning book, which is titled Hurricane Jim Crow: How the Great Sea Island Storm of 1893 Shaped the Lowcountry South. This was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2022. It won the Rachel Hines Prize from the College of Charleston's Carolina Lowcountry and Atlantic World Program. And it just recently won the Deep South Book Prize from the Summersell Center for the Study of the South at the University of Alabama. And I'll just go ahead and read a little bit of praise for the book. This is from that prize committee. Hurricane Jim Crow is an intense and heart-rending account of the destruction, aftermath, and lasting legacies of the 1893 Sea Islands hurricane. Thoughtfully written and provocative, Grego's book serves as a harrowing reminder of the power of the earth and the legacies disasters produce. So we're going to have something that's not a disaster today. Although there is a storm front brewing in the Caribbean and Gulf that maybe will reach us in a couple of days. So I guess we're never more than a couple of days out from a possible hurricane. So the title of the podcast here is Take on the South. And so we'll start here. If you can tell us a little bit about your take on the South. Sure. So maybe a little bit about, do you think of yourself as a Southerner?
Sure. So I grew up in Columbia, and despite writing my book about the Low Country, the Midlands is very much, where I call home. And when I was invited to be on the podcast, I was, I'm delighted by the concept and the idea of taking on the South. And so what I've been up to the last few days has been trying to sort of re-immerse myself in the Midlands and to think a little bit about Southern environmental history in particular, both because I knew we'd be discussing it some here on this podcast and talking about it at an event a little later today too. And so what I did was something that I think would be sort of familiar to you, Kent, which is I took a drive and a couple of walks. Where moving through the landscape is always one good way of stimulating thought about it. And this was partially inspired, really, by your piece that you have written for a forthcoming collection with USC Press for next year, where you took a bike ride down the Palmetto Trail from Columbia down towards the Low Country. And what I did for my drive was I went down Bluff Road to Old Bluff Road. I stopped by the Congaree Visitor Center to take a look at the huge cypress log that they have there in the parking lot. And this particular cypress log was dredged up by a salvage company, where what they do is they dredge up these old cypress logs that were logged or fell and thus sank into Lake Marion or the rivers and waterways that sort of lead to and from it. They dredge them up. Sometimes they turn them into furniture. They mill them. They sell them off to people who want to use salvage cypress in projects. But in this particular case, they donated this large cypress to Congaree because it's hollowed out in the center. Can't really be milled or turned into a productive project in the same way that a whole log would be. So I stopped by that to visit it and to think a little bit about how, to me, in a lot of ways, this kind of salvaged log and its sort of rebirth and return to Congaree sums up a lot of what has started to percolate and what I sort of think about Southern environmental history, which is the word that has kept coming to my head in the last couple of weeks, which is remnants. Remnants. When I think of Southern environmental history, it's a field that really has only taken root in the last, 30 or so years, right? It doesn't have the same sort of origin point in the 60s and 70s environmental movement that environmental history as a field more broadly does. And instead, it comes from a different set of concerns. And this is partially because when people think of the South, or certainly the Midlands of South Carolina, one doesn't necessarily think of spectacular landscapes. Right? You don't think of Yosemite, you don't think of the Grand Canyon, you don't think of these sort of awe-inspiring vistas that...
So the Marlboro Man is not from South Carolina.
No.
Yeah.
You instead think about these landscapes that show remnants of what they were. Even Congaree National Park, which, I love very dearly as a fascinating and interesting space, is itself a remnant, right? There's old-growth bald cypress and tupelo there, very large trees, but significant parts of it have been logged, and the parts of it that were not logged significantly still bear the touches of human hands, right? Whether through enslaved workers who engaged in, a certain scale of agriculture there, or enslaved cattlemen who, chased cows and pigs through the swamps in the 1800s.
There's something about cattle mounts.
Yes, there are cattle mounds there too, yes, some of which were built on old Native American mounds and shell rings as well. So when I think about Southern environmental history and when I think about what these sort of Southern landscapes mean, I think about how we have to consider what remnants mean and how history has sort of accreted on the landscape, how visible the human influence is on these landscapes, and how you don't necessarily look for, nor should you necessarily need to find pristine nature, so to speak, there, right? You can find beauty and many points of interest, but you're not necessarily going to find something that's pristine. But that, to me, I think is part of what makes it so fascinating, and part of what makes it, I think, meaningful, especially for us historians.
So is environmental history, particularly if you think about the South, is it more hidden than other histories?
I suppose it depends on what your lens is, right? As you drive through places like Lower Richland County, you don't necessarily see what you would think of off the top of your head as nature in a way. But once you begin to think about what nature could look like, perhaps you see it everywhere, right? You see, some very well kept up homesteads of folks who have lived there for many generations. But you also see places where, homes have been moved out of, and so you see greenery retaking those houses. You see scrubby new pine lands growing in where there might have been a clear cut a decade or so ago. You see other ways that nature sort of regenerates and interacts with these more human spaces in Southern landscapes, I think.
So I'm wondering about Congaree National Park. So your life experience in some ways is in tandem with the development of that as a national monument and a national park. So it becomes a national park as you're growing up.
Yeah.
How do you, so you spent a lot of time at Congaree National Park
Yes.
growing up, and you've now spent a lot of time being a Southern environmental historian. How does going back to Congaree as a professional historian that's trained to see things, how does that park look now?
I feel like in some ways I trained myself to see as an environmental historian by visiting Congaree, if that makes sense. I think that the development there is very much, as you said, occurred sort of in tandem. This was because some of the places that you can go visit in Congaree mean you can't ignore what the human history has been. So, for example, if you go and visit some of the pine forest along the bluff edge, there are old homesteads littered all throughout that. And you can see it in a multitude of ways. In some cases, it's because, some of these homesteads have collapsed and you can see the lumber and so forth there. In other cases, it's smaller traces. So my dad always points out how if you see, my dad is an environmental advocate who has spent a great deal of time in Congaree. If you see, for example, a clump of daffodils or other bulb flowers in the park, that signals that there was likely a homestead nearby before the park itself was developed. So it's interesting to visit these landscapes and you see those traces of it, right? This evidence of human habitation. And that's not even to mention all of the old stills that you can see throughout the park landscape.
It seems to be some of the most popular things.
Yes, oh yeah, people love to see the old liquor stills, whiskey, moonshine stills throughout the park too. So yeah, I feel like that sort of trained me in a way. Going through these southern landscapes with their remnants of both nature and human habitation certainly helped to shape me as an environmental historian.
There's this notion that I've been thinking about a lot of how some of the beautiful spots in the South are next to some of the trashiest spots, and how you have, in Southern life, there's this sacred and profane that often exists in the same space. And I'm wondering, how do you see that? So you have this beautiful Congaree Park, but then there are these other remnants of American life that are there that probably will outlast us, think about all the plastics and the trash.
Yeah. I mean, certainly there's plenty of literal trash in Congaree, both the stills, right, which are sort of moldering and flaking and rusting away there in the park. At the old homesteads, you can find detritus. You find, once we found a glass container with Pond's on the bottom, so a bottle of Pond's cold cream, from the 20s or 30s or whatever, out there in this national park from people who had lived there long ago. But I also think about this too, where, I continued my drive, and this involved driving. Continued going down Bluff, turned right onto Highway 601, and then took that series of bridges and causeways over the floodplain, and of course the Congaree River itself into Calhoun County. And along that stretch of Highway 601, which cuts through park lands, there's an immense amount of trash. All along the roadsides, people have flicked their cigarette butts out the window. You see cans. You see animals that have been killed by careless motorists. You see old tire parts from people who've blown their tires out as they were driving. You see all of this as you move through what is ostensibly, a national park landscape, basically. And I think that description, sacred and profane, is absolutely sort of a duality at the heart of this. And it's very visible. You can't ignore it, really. When you ask about how do you see these landscapes, I mean, really, you just have to open your eyes and look. That's the thing about it, is I don't think it's necessarily hidden so much as it is unable to be ignored. It's so obvious when you drive through it.
Think of the Mary Oliver line, I know how to pay attention.
Yes, yeah. And I think that's something that really strikes me about these southern landscapes and what marks southern environmental history is that I suppose, if what you're looking for, if you're looking for something that isn't there, then, maybe you'll miss the kind of obvious way in which nature and humans have sort of lived and worked alongside each other on these southern landscapes. But yeah, I don't think it's too hard to miss if you just open your eyes a little bit, really.
So think about Southern environmental history and the human attempts to master nature or control nature, and how terrible humans are at that ultimately.
Yeah.
It's often a history of failure of humans to adequately control nature. And thinking of the Congaree and all of those giant trees that were blown down from Hurricane Hugo.
Yes, yeah.
It's your book clearly shows us the power of the natural world to reshape the way human beings exist in landscapes. And so I'm wondering if you could take us back to August of 1893 and feel the wind shift a little bit and then start to get a little bit more humid, and tell us about that storm.
Sure. So this is where I find some of the historiographic framing around disaster history a little bit tricky for me in some ways. So there's a recent insistence that I immensely respect and that I use as a framework really throughout my book, but I also have some points of resistance to, which is the idea is that there's no such thing as a natural disaster, right? That hurricanes and floods and earthquakes, that their devastating impacts on people are ultimately just as much from human systems of inequity and mistreatment as they are anything that Mother Nature herself has wrought. And I think that's true in many ways, and certainly my book traces what those human impacts are and how specific groups of people tried to wield and use the destruction of the hurricane to harness it to their own sort of political and economic ends, right? But at the same time, there's something remarkable about this particular hurricane. There are some experiences that are beyond human control fully, right? And so balancing between the fact that these human impacts of the storm are, immensely important, and they have there's history behind disasters that we have to understand and trace. But at the same time, yes, this particular hurricane was a behemoth, and that did indeed show sort of the power of nature in the Low Country in 1893. So, yes.
So there were, and I know I've heard you talk about this in a talk, but so this would have been today identified a Category 3 storm?
Yeah. Of course, the way that we categorize hurricanes now didn't exist at the time, but based on what data we have, it would have been a Category 3 storm. And we know this largely through the efforts of a U.S. Weather Bureau agent named Louis Chesanovsky, who was stationed in Charleston. And Charleston was not, the part of the coast worst hit by the storm. That was down in Beaufort County. So if anything, what he recorded in Charleston was slightly lesser than what would have been felt further down the coast. But what Chesanovsky did was he spent the night, because this hurricane struck overnight, sort of late afternoon on Sunday, August 27th, is when residents of the Low Country began to notice and fear that perhaps a large hurricane was going to make landfall.
You know how people in 1893 would have sensed that or known that?
That is a really interesting thing. So, of course, they did not have radar. They had no way of knowing, specifically when a hurricane would hit. You would maybe have, at half day's notice when you began to realize that perhaps the storm that seemed to be arriving on the coast was especially dangerous.
So like when the water starts rising?
Yeah, basically when the water starts rising, when the wind starts rising and gains this sort of strength and relentlessness.
And there's no warning system really for people?
No, the only warning system, you would hope, but what they had was the U.S. Weather Bureau. And the Weather Bureau had agents and stations up and down the Atlantic coast and had some contacts in the Caribbean as well. So Chesanovsky had really received a telegraph from one of the Caribbean offices warning that some ships had encountered a massive hurricane, that ships that had sort of straggled into port and delivered notice of this. Now, of course, there was no sense of where this particular storm would go or what it would look like once it actually reached the U.S. mainland. Chesanovsky had some suspicions. He knew that there was a low front sitting over the mountains that might sort of draw the storm in. But Jesnovsky also only had access to Charleston. So he hoisted a flag on the top of his office building, which was on Bay Street in Charleston, warning Charlestonians that there might be an incoming gale. But that was the extent of it, and that's just peninsular Charleston, right? That's not anybody on the islands. There was no real way of getting communication out to the Sea Islands, certainly not necessarily sort of, down to, places like St. Helena Island, further down the coast, Hilton Head, and so on.
At night?
Yes, it did. So that's the other part of it, is not only did people have essentially no warning, but this also struck at its worst at night, right? And this particular hurricane was huge. Hugo is actually a pretty good sort of analogy for what the sort of size and strength of the storm would have been. As far as I can tell, the storm...
Hurricane Hugo is about a century after.
Yeah. Hurricane Hugo, almost exactly just shy of a century afterward. The storm surge was approximately the same, anywhere from 12 to 20 feet of water inundating the low-lying parts of the coast. Jesnovsky in Charleston records 125 mile per hour winds. But again, it could have been higher further down. We just don't have those particular records. And the sort of diameter of the storm, too, was immense in the same way that Hugo was, stretching across several hundred miles. This storm, though, yes, strikes at night, and also brought with it what a number of observers referred to as a tidal wave. Now, this is kind of tricky, and this is where sort of parsing historical records became one of the kind of challenges of this. So people perceived the storm surge coming in as...
I guess many of the records that somebody might have had would have in the water, maybe got washed away, or recording it after.
Yes, but a night that terrifying and that frightening certainly would have heightened their impression of the impacts of the storm, right? And so James Henry Rice, who is a prominent South Carolina naturalist and landowner, dismissed these reports of the tidal wave. And he said, well, what really happened is this storm was so huge, and it struck at high tide, too. This storm was so enormous that it essentially prevented the two previous high tides from going out again. So it sort of dragged with it 3 high tides onto the coast, and that's what led to such an enormous storm surge. And water did rise very quickly, and again, grew to such depths on places like Kiowa Island and St. Helena and Edisto and other places along the coast that people felt of it as a tidal wave, even though, of course, it wasn't really, right? So yes, it hit in the middle of the night. It had these high winds. It carried with it the force of the ocean behind it. It was a frightening experience.
Somebody experiencing this, obviously we don't know, right? But you've studied this. I mean, what could it be like to be in 1893? There are no street lights.
Yeah.
You just hear wind and things falling. I mean, what was it like from the experiences that you have collected in your book?
Fortunately, there are quite a few, and I think I'll refer specifically here to one from the sheriff of Beaufort County, who is an African-American man. He might have been the only black sheriff in the country at that time. His name was George A. Reed, and he lived on a 2-story house sort of along the edges of one of the rivers near Beaufort. So
where people lived generally would have been along these waterways?
Yes, in these low-lying areas and so forth. And so George Reed lived in the house, I believe, with his mother and his sister. And he wrote and had published his account of the storm in the newspapers a couple days later. And he talked about, this pitch black, the way the rising winds, often made it hard to hear what was happening. And he said, but despite that, yes, you could hear trees cracking and falling. You could hear, wharves and boats and houses being caved in. And he said you could also hear screams, too, that were sometimes able to sort of pierce the gale of people, struggling through the waves and the storm. In some cases, trying to ride out the storm in their houses. He writes about how some people tied themselves up into trees to try to escape the high water. And he talks, too, about how people would attempt to make it to high ground. And this is repeated in a number of accounts, too, where very frequently people had an understanding of which places on islands were a little bit higher than others.
The high ground in the low country.
Yeah, exactly. High ground in the low country. And so trying to make it to those houses that might be on slightly higher ground was certainly something that many African Americans, especially on these low-lying areas, either, whether along rivers or on ocean-facing islands, would attempt to make it to these homes. But that, of course, too, was incredibly difficult because of the high winds, because of the lashing rain, and because of the incoming storm surge. So in trying to make it to safety, people would often perish in pursuit of that, too. So it was a night that in certain ways defies description. You know, I talk about the night the hurricane hit in chapter 2 of my book, and I rewrote that chapter probably 10 times between, writing it for my dissertation in 2017 and the book coming out in 2022. It was very hard to try to capture and to do any kind of justice to what that night must have felt like, because there are a significant number of accounts of the night of the storm. But figuring out how to order it, how to write about it in a way that does it any justice without making it seem like I'm trying to be melodramatic or sort of, exploitative in some way about what these thousands of residents of the Low Country lived through was decidedly a challenge. Because, this was a very, very frightening night that many people attempted to live through and that many did not.
And so in your research, can you tell us how many people died that night? Is that possible?
This is part of what has also made this process tricky. It's very hard to know. Estimates range. The really safe number, I think, is 1,500. But Clara Barton, who led the American Red Cross in a recovery effort from Beaufort, South Carolina for 9 months, from October of 1893 until the summer of 1894, estimated that as many as 5,000 people may have died. Now, Barton may have been counting people who died in the weeks and months later from sickness, from hunger, from exposure, from injuries they incurred during the hurricane that they were not ultimately able to get proper medical care for. But regardless, it is safe to say that thousands of people perished in this storm, and certainly more died afterwards as well.
Why is it so difficult to count the dead?
Yeah. It's difficult to count the dead, partially simply because death records don't exist in the same way, partially because the 1890 census functionally doesn't exist anymore. It was a casualty of a fire that destroyed many of the records of the 1890 census. So trying to use that even to sort of parse the number of people who lived in this place in 1890 versus in 1900, that has been taken away from us historians as a tool to sort of discern what this may have been. And because, too, many of the people who died, the vast majority, were African Americans living in rural and isolated places. And their families or family members who may have survived may not have been able to record or log their deaths with authorities in a way that would leave a record for us historians to count today, too.
So I'm wondering if I could talk you into reading. So I teach... Sure. A class called Historian's Craft here, where we have our undergraduates learn about the history major and writing history. And I think you have such a almost perfect first sentence to the opening of your book. And I'm just wondering if I could get you to maybe read your first couple of lines here. And I'll go ahead and pregame things. And so this is, it's the preface. It's called The List. The list of the dead is piecemeal and relentless. So that's the first line of the book. And I'm wondering if you could just read us here.
Sure, of course. The list of the dead is piecemeal and relentless. Extended families, married couples, children bearing only the last names of their mother or father. No name, only unknown body. 282 entries line the pages of the forever partial list of the dead, collected over 2 days by a group of hastily deputized, exhausted assistants to the Beaufort County coroner after the Great Sea Island storm rolled through the Low Country on the night of August 27th to 28th, 1893.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
So when the sun comes up, what's left?
A lot of trash, a lot of detritus, actually. Accounts, including from George Reed and many others, talk about how the Low Country was clogged with crops, with the bodies of dead animals, with blown down parts of houses, with boats that had been crunched up against the shore, with wharves that were fully dismantled and turned into maybe a few pilings left, if that. Cotton warehouses with their stock soaked down and ruined. People looked out and saw a wrecked landscape, right? That was unfamiliar and strange to them, and even strange in ways too that I think of as quite different from what you think of when you think of the Low Country in August. The hurricane stripped all the trees of their leaves, for example. So there was this strange sort of appearance of winter amidst the heat of a Low Country August. And accounts also talk a great deal about the stench, too, where all of this rotting organic material made the whole country smell awful. And all of this, compounds the trauma that, of course, many people were feeling as they emerged from their houses or remained of them or climbed down from the trees where they had lashed themselves or tried to sort of fight their way out of whatever sort of floodwaters surrounded their homes. It was a scene of just utter and catastrophic devastation on a scale that is difficult for me to imagine. And I think that's difficult to really fully grasp, too. And it assaulted people in all of their senses. George Reed, the Beaufort County Sheriff, talks about how by morning everybody became a grave digger. And one of the main things that people did as soon as they got up was tried to locate other community members, family members, and loved ones to see if they had survived or not. And if they hadn't, then everybody took on the responsibility of trying to find the dead. And many of them might not necessarily have been reported to the Beaufort County coroner. They might have been buried as quickly as possible.
Many tombstones or markers.
Exactly. There are a couple sites I know of for sure in Beaufort County that likely contain mass graves from the hurricane that are not marked in any way. Eustis Plantation, for example, on Ladies Island, was a place where I believe 54 people drowned and were buried in a mass grave just a few feet deep. On the phosphate works, the Crusoe Phosphate Works, sort of a little bit inland in Beaufort, but along one of the marshes and riverways there. Dozens of people died and were similarly, buried in a mass grave as well. And yes, these places, they don't have grave markers. I don't know that those deaths were necessarily ever reported to the coroner. I certainly know that the Eustis Plantation ones, I don't think appear in the coroner records of that list mentioned there.
These hidden sites of consecration that we may never know about.
Yes, yeah. And I mean, some of them may even be, eroding into the ocean at this point, too, because they were often sort of right along the edges of these waterways, which are themselves, quite mutable by nature, but of course are only growing more submerged as the years go by with sea level rise in the Low Country, too.
So I'll take some liberties with the argument that you make in your book.
Sure.
About think about remnants here. So we've been talking. So is Reconstruction one of the things that's also destroyed in this? Is Reconstruction, the remnants of Reconstruction, part of what is at stake here in the aftermath of the storm?
Absolutely. So Beaufort County is indeed one of those remnants of Reconstruction, right? Well, when we as historians teach about Reconstruction, we usually say, well, 1876, 1877 is the year that Reconstruction ends because that's the year where federal troops are fully withdrawn, where the federal government turns its back on the South, on black Southerners, and where in many states, white Democrats, white supremacists retake state governments through a variety of dirty tricks and, fraudulent voting and out-and-out violence to reclaim their sort of political position at the top of the pyramid in the South. But Beaufort County is different. As I've been mentioning George Reed, this black sheriff of Beaufort County, and that is sort of representative of what this county looked like. Beaufort County was 93% African American in 1890, and the majority of African Americans who lived there owned their own land. Due to that sort of overwhelming black majority in this case, and due to some legacies of the Civil War era Port Royal experiment and other sort of Reconstruction era reforms that occurred there, African Americans were able to hold on to and develop forms of political and landed autonomy that allowed them to hold on to sort of the legacies and promises of Reconstruction in a way that black Southerners elsewhere were unable to do so due to...
This is a threat to local white supremacists.
Yes, it is. And so in 1893, Beaufort County, again, yes, you still have African-American men who hold public political office there. African-American men are still voting in significant numbers. African-Americans still own land at very high rates, unmatched elsewhere in the South. But the rest of the state doesn't look like that. Right? In the rest of the state, black voting was massively eroded, not only by, Wade Hampton's reconquest of the state in 1876, but through a series of laws in the 1880s, which took away the black vote essentially in the rest of the state, and due to the fact that black land ownership was simply not as high in other parts of the state as it was in Beaufort County too. So yeah, Beaufort County is a remnant of Reconstruction.
Population of South Carolina at this point
was still a black majority.
Still a black majority.
Yeah, still a black majority, but especially concentrated in places like Beaufort County, which again, 93% black is a very high sort of rate of that there.
So part of what your book helps lead us through as the reader is the sense that many white leaders had of this as an opportunity to reduce the kind of power that was in a base there in Beaufort. I wonder if you just a minute or two, tell us a little bit about that part of it.
Yeah, of course. So yes, the rest of the state is sort of being engulfed by, white supremacist politicians once again. And Beaufort County is sort of this... Yes, and this is the one last holdout. And yes, Beaufort County comes... under sort of direct scrutiny by men like Benjamin Ryan Tillman, who was elected governor in 1890. Himself, of course, a wealthy landowner who sort of mimed a populist streak in order to ascend to office. And places like Beaufort County immensely frustrated him because he saw the black majority in the Low Country and in Beaufort County in particular as a threat to white supremacy in the rest of the state. So both in the aftermath of the hurricane and in subsequent years, Tillman and other white politicians, even those he sometimes clashed with on other topics, really take aim at the Low Country's black majority. For example, you have a former mayor of Charleston who essentially says that, well, if the hurricane killed a large number of black residents of the Low Country, then, at least that reduces the black majority some so that it can be an easier process of retaking the state for white supremacy. So you have a number of white landowners and politicians who view the hurricane as an opportunity and who see the destruction that it wrought against black residents of the Low Country is something that could, for them, have a positive, so to speak, outcome in the retaking of the state for Jim Crow. So yes, Tillman takes aim at the Low Country, and you see him direct a great deal of virulence, especially in the years right after the hurricane, towards arguing that black residents of the Low Country need to be cleared out. That as long as there is that stronghold of the black population there and black land ownership there, South Carolina can never really be safe for white supremacy. And this is echoed by a number of other landowners and politicians afterwards.
Do they argue that there's a misuse of the land by the African-American landowners?
Yes. So in part 3 of the book, I dive into this some where Tillman and the Gonzalez brothers, who operate and owned the state newspaper,
the monument here, in Columbia, right off campus.
Yes, and others who they write about the hurricane and they write about the destruction of the hurricane as creating a potential sort of opportunity for clearing out the rest of the black majority. This is also echoed by Harry Hammond, who is another sort of political scion of the state and a prominent agricultural policymaker. So Tillman, Gonzalez, the Gonzalez brothers, and Hammond all sort of develop this argument in the wake of the hurricane, that the hurricane in certain ways sort of presents a potential opportunity for truly sort of reclaiming the Low Country from its black population and reclaiming the Low Country environment too for the use of white farmers who could subsequently move in if African Americans are cleared out of this region. Because with the idea is if the low country environment was remade through drainage and through reclaiming it through these agricultural practices and through clearing out its black majority, it would become this sort of new fertile Eden upon which Jim Crow in the state could sort of flourish for whites.
So your book explores this recovery process. You talk about the Red Cross.
Yeah.
I just checked the cost of your book. It's about $20 to get the paperback, and so it is a rich piece of writing and a rich piece of research. I'm wondering here at the end if I can do something unfair as a historian and ask you to leap forward a century, or maybe a little beyond a century, and tell us how the Low Country maybe was different when you get to Hurricane Hugo, and how the Low Country is different today in terms of how its land is and who lives there and that sort of thing.
Sure. So, of course, one thing I argue in the book is that the hurricane essentially helps along the process of preparing the Low Country for its corporate development that really begins to kick into gear in the mid-20th century. So the hurricane hurries processes of black outmigration from the Low Country. It exacerbates the economic depression there too, where there's not really sort of an economic path forward after the hurricane because it wrecks rice, it wrecks cotton, it wrecks phosphate. And so the region sort of lapses into this economically depressed state for decades. And with the population reduced and with there being no sort of viable agrarian economic future, this land sits fallow. And after World War II, of course, there's a renewed interest in building vacation homes and in sort of experiencing this coastal southern nature anew. And with that, you have a newly rooted interest in developing the coast for tourism and for vacationers, predominantly white, of course, right? And so by the time Hugo blows through in the late 1980s, it's a very different sort of pastiche of a southern landscape than it is in 1893, where alongside the significant number of African Americans who continued to live on the coast and still owned plots of land there, you have had a significant number of them sort of pushed out by rising property taxes and real estate prices too. And so many of these very vulnerable pieces of land that had once been the home of African Americans are now the sites of multi-million-dollar beachfront houses, right, owned by fairly wealthy people. And so that's an interesting kind of reversal from 1893, right, whereas places like Kiowa Island were highly undesirable as a place to live for the white elite because it was so low-lying and, vulnerable to the vagaries of Mother Nature. Instead, it's become desirable and expensive, right? But the hurricane of 1893 helped make that possible because it contributes to this sort of decline that makes it attractive as cheap real estate to be purchased up and sold off once more once there's a new meaning sort of layered on to what this landscape can do for people. So yes, then Hugo arrives and I think we're still kind of grappling with a lot of the legacies of Hugo, right? Both in terms of the fact that, I hate to say this, but on the one hand, it doesn't feel like it's necessarily changed as much as perhaps it should have, right? People have continued to build on beachfront properties and live there and enjoy them in the decades since. Charleston has changed, of course. It's gotten a major facelift in the 1990s due to Mayor Riley's sort of efforts to revive and refurbish the city after Hugo. But as always, one of the kind of difficult things about Southern history and Southern environmental history is what lessons have people really learned and internalized? And do we actually see any structural changes around us due to these these catastrophes that we keep undergoing over and over again cyclically? They're each different a little bit each time, but nonetheless, there's this real sort of cyclical way that disaster operates in the Low Country that I think can be frustrating, not just for historians, but for contemporary residents who would like to see things change there.
But there's still live oaks, and there's still Spanish moss, and the wind comes off the ocean. And so even though human beings are there, there's still something else operating.
Yes.
Well, I want to thank you so much for what's been a great conversation for me, and I think we've learned an enormous amount here. And the book is Hurricane Jim Crow, and it is available wherever you buy your books or buy your ebooks. It's available in ebooks. So if you're my age and your eyes have failed on you, you can get the ebook and make the print as large as you want to make it. Thank you, Dr. Grego, for your take on the South. I'm Kent Germany, and this is the University of South Carolina and the Institute of Southern Studies.
That was our Take on the South. Let us know yours. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at U of SC South. Take on the South is produced by Matt Simmons of the Institute for Southern Studies. Special thanks to Professor Dave Garner of the University of South Carolina School of Music for composing our music. Tune in next time for another Take on the South.